Part 1. Curse of the River Goddess, Igbaghon's Revenge. Igbaghon was once a human being like you or me. She lived in a small, quiet village with her parents and did all the things young girls did. Sometimes she was tiresome, but she could also be extremely charming. As Igbaghon grew older, her parents began to notice something unusual about their child. It was nothing they could ever put their fingers on, but she had a strange defiant spark in her eyes that was most unsettling. She was always asking the strangest questions and perplexing her poor old parents. Her mother muttered often enough,
"That child is cleverer than she has any right to be."
And she meant it too. Igbaghon's parents were simple folk, living a simple life. In their peasant's life of toil and grind, there was no room for unnecessary questions. All the mother ever wanted was for her daughter to settle down with a nice man and raise a family. As the years passed, Igbaghon's mother grew increasingly alarmed. It did not look as if her daughter would ever get married. Her fiercely independent spirit put off suitors. Men did not want wives who told them what to do. Women were expected to keep their mouths shut and know their place. Eventually, Igbaghon's parents decided that enough was enough. Something had to be done about their daughter. All the girls her age were married and having children. Why should their daughter be any different? So these two simple folk went looking for a husband for Igbaghon. They found the energy. He lived in a grand palace with several servants and wives to attend to his every need. Now it is true that Igbaghon was a peasant's daughter. How she came to be given in marriage to a titled chief as grand as the energy will probably never be known. But this is what happened, and so the story continues. You might have thought that because Igbaghon's future husband was a wealthy man, she was a lucky young woman on her way to a life of privilege and luxury. But this was not to be the case. The energy had a reputation, and not a very good one. He was well known for collecting wives the way others collected clothes, and for discarding them in a similar manner. There were rumors about some of the awful things he did to his wives. But Igbaghon's parents shrugged off the warnings of friends. They were desperate to get their daughter married and off their hands. Already she had reached an age when people were talking. So early one morning, Igbaghon packed her dearest possessions, said an emotional goodbye to her parents, for she knew that she would never see them again, and set off on the journey that would take her to the village of her husband-to-be. It did not take Igbaghon long to realize what sort of man her husband was. He was mean, nasty, and egotistic. Igbaghon had no intention of behaving like his other dutiful wives, scrambling for the morsels of attention he tossed their way, or bickering like fishwives. She did not bother making friends with the other women because she knew they would never understand her. She much preferred her own company. Soon she had acquainted herself with her new environment, exploring the forest by day and night. When she needed friends, the animals were there for her. And for a while, Igbaghon was content. There were very few people who knew exactly how many wives the energy had. The energy was not one of them. He had almost forgotten he had taken Igbaghon as a wife when one day he happened to see her entering the palace grounds.
"Who is that?"
he asked his attendants, and was not a little surprised when he was told. From then on, he took a special interest in Igbaghon. He noticed at once she preferred to keep to herself instead of mixing with the other women. He noticed also that there was something strange about her, something he could never quite put his finger on. Even though he would never admit it, there was something about her that made him uneasy. Was it the defiant spark that burned in her eyes when he insulted her? Or was it something else? What was it exactly, he often wondered. The energy did not know, but one thing he was sure about was that whatever it was, he did not like it. The energy was a man who was used to being in control. When he wanted something, it was a brave person that dared refuse. The energy decided that what he wanted was to remove the defiant spark that shone so brightly in Igbaghon's eyes. Then, he believed, she would be passive and submissive like his other wives. So he beat and bullied her unrelentingly. Daily, he dreamed of numerous ways of humiliating her. It gave him pleasure to abuse her in front of strangers and children. He would watch her cower, but still the strange, defiant spark remained in her eyes. Never one to admit defeat, This desperately unpleasant man encouraged all his children, especially his eldest son, Emokpagbe, whom he adored, to mock and bully Igbaghon. He hoped that they would succeed where he had not, but they did not, for nothing ruffled Igbaghon. Finally, with particularly malicious glee, the energy decided to ban Igbaghon from leaving the palace and thereby cutting off her final link with the outside world. He fervently hoped that this would subdue her. But after a few weeks, the energy again realized that his latest plan had failed, for Igbaghon was still as defiant as ever. Igbaghon refused to obey her husband's orders. She would sneak out of the palace under the cover of darkness to enjoy her long, peaceful walks in the forest and her conversations with the creatures of the woods. One day, Igbaghon was returning from one of her forbidden visits. She sneaked into the palace and down the main corridor which would take her to her room. As she crept along the passageway, she saw a light from her husband's sitting room. Realizing he was still awake, she removed her sandals and prepared to steal past the door. Sounds of laughter reverberated through the walls. Igbaghon realized that the energy had company. She tiptoed past the partially shut door and had gone few feet when she stopped. She crept back to the door and listened. Igbaghon was sure she had heard her name. Through the crack in the door, she could see that there were 3 other men in the room besides her husband. The men were older, much older than her husband. She watched them for a few moments before realizing that they were priests. As she stood behind the door listening to the conversation in the other room, she suddenly became more frightened than she had ever been in her whole life. The energy was discussing a festival to honor his ancestors. This festival was a grand affair which was performed once a year. Apparently this year's celebrations would be special because the energy was planning to sacrifice to his ancestors, not just the usual cows and goats. He had called the priests to discuss the human sacrifice he had decided to make. The sacrificial victim would be none other than Igbaghon. Instinct told Igbaghon to run, make for the forests and run. But she knew that she would be caught eventually and return to her husband. There was nowhere for her to go. She could not return to her parents' home. A wife who left her husband's home, whatever the circumstances, was considered to have brought shame and disgrace on the family. Igbaghon returned to her room. As she sat on the bed staring through a window at the full moon, she prayed to her ancestors. Silently, she begged them to help her. The ancestors must have heard her, for then a miracle happened. A cloud floated by, obscuring the face of the moon for a moment, and in that instant the transformation happened. Igbaghon became an eagle. The proud, majestic bird sat on the windowsill for a few moments. Then she squeezed herself out through the iron bars, spread her wings, and flew away. As Igbaghon flew deeper and deeper into the forests, soaring over the treetops, she did not once look back. Her silent resolve was that, if she ever came across anything belonging to the energy, she would destroy it, utterly. Dawn was breaking when Igbaghon got to a place she thought she could make her home. She swooped towards the ground. As soon as her claws touched the earth, a mighty river was formed. Igbaghon entered the water and became immortal. 10 years later, Igbaghon ruled in the underworld below the waters. She was the goddess of the river. In her magnificent palace, she had great wealth and numerous servants. Igbaghon had transformed into a Mami Water, a mystical mermaid that lived and thrived gracefully underwater. She had beautiful, flowing African hair that sparkled like the river at dawn. Her eyes gleamed with an otherworldly light, and her shimmering scaled tail glistened with every shade of blue and green. But even though Igbaghon was now free from the tyranny of her husband to live the life of luxury and peace she had always dreamed of, she still harbored a deep hatred for all human beings. She kept her promise to destroy any who dared to trespass on her territory. So people who came to the banks of the river to fetch water or bathe never returned to their homes. As years went by, the river gained a fearful reputation. People stopped using its waters. No one even dared venture within sight of it. At night, wise old men would narrate stories to the young about the powerful, unsettled spirit of the river who refused to be pacified with sacrifices or gifts. One day, Igbaghon was playing with her maids when a servant came rushing up to her.
What is it?
She asked impatiently. She was winning at the game of Io, and she did not want to be disturbed.
My lady,
The maid said urgently.
a young mortal man sits by the river, washing his feet in your waters.
At this, Igbaghon immediately lost interest in the game. She turned to the maid.
Can this be true?
She cried, frowning in annoyance. The young girl nodded meekly. Igbaghon got up suddenly, pushing her maids out of the way. She swam through her palace and up to the surface of the waters. The clear waters parted as Igbaghon rose to the top. She remained still for a moment as she took in her surroundings. It had been so long since she had come up to the world of mortals that everything seemed new and a little strange. The dense forests bordering the banks were encroaching on her domain, their roots practically growing in her waters. I must speak to the tree spirit about that, Igbaghon thought fleetingly. It was a fine day, and the skies were blue. But the sun shone so fiercely that it hurt her eyes. Igbaghon looked away quickly, and then she saw him. It was true. A young man sat on a rock by the bank of the river. He had removed his sandals and was dabbling his feet in the water. Anger immediately welled up inside Igbaghon. How dare he, she thought. Has he not heard of my powers? The trespasser was not aware of Igbaghon's presence, nor that of her handmaidens some distance away. He seemed preoccupied with his own private thoughts as he continued to stare down into the river, letting the clear, refreshing waters bathe his feet. As Igbaghon neared the young man, she suddenly recognized him. He was Emokpagbe, her husband's eldest son. Now I will have revenge, she thought as she silently slipped out onto the bank. She transformed her tail into human legs and ran up to Emokpagbe. Before he knew what was happening, she had grabbed hold of his arm in an iron grip. Emokpagbe looked up, startled, then amazed and humbled by the radiant figure that stood before him. The defiant spark that shone in her eyes seemed to burn through him.
So you have come to taunt me?
Igbaghon cried angrily.
Have you not heard of what happens to trespassers? Or are you merely a brave fool?
Emokpagbe stood up slowly, taking in Igbaghon's impressive presence. It occurred to him that something about her was familiar, and he wondered where he could have been so fortunate to have met such a majestic and impressive figure of a woman.
I don't understand. I didn't mean to trespass, but I've been traveling for days. I do not know these parts well.
Igbaghon stared up at Emokpagbe.
So you do not know who I am?
She said slowly, a hard smile creasing her face.
I'm sure I would have remembered if I had had the pleasure of meeting you.
Emokpagbe replied, all sweetness and charm.
Could you let go of my arm?
He continued.
It's hurting.
Look closer.
Igbaghon said, squeezing the arm tighter and bringing her face nearer to his. Puzzled, Emokpagbe suddenly realized that they had an audience. Numerous mermaids sat on the rocks dotted around the banks of the river, watching in silence. He was extremely uneasy as he allowed himself to stare into Igbaghon's face. It was a beautiful face, but her skin was the strangest he had ever seen, covered as it was with tiny translucent scales. The defiant eyes stared hard at Emokpagbe, and guiltily he took his eyes away.
How is your father?
She asked softly. Emokpagbe suddenly felt as if he had been slapped, cold and hard. Now he remembered.
You are.
He stammered.
Yes, now you know who I am. Take a moment. Look around you.
Igbaghon sneered, pointing to the mermaids who surrounded them and the vast expanse of river beyond.
All this is mine. How does it compare with your father's miserable palace?
Please let me go. I promise never to come this way again.
Emokpagbe began to beg.
Why should I show you any mercy when you used to make fun of me? When you put snakes in my bed or bugs in my food, did you ever show me any mercy?
It was a long time ago. I did not mean it, any of it. I was only a child then. I am sorry, desperately sorry. I would do anything now to make it up to you. If I told Baba, I'm sure he would be happy to give you whatever you asked for. Or I could...
That old fool.
Igbaghon spat, cutting him short.
What could he give me that I do not already own?
She paused to think for a moment.
But if my memory serves me well, you were the most precious thing in his life. To destroy you would be revenge enough for me.
She continued. the handmaiden saw the anger in their mistress and rushed up to her to plead for the young man's life. Igbaghon listened to their cries of mercy. Eventually, she turned to Emokpagbe and told him to be thankful that his life was saved. The young man knelt down to thank her, but no words came from his mouth. Igbaghon re-entered the water. The last thing Emokpagbe heard as she disappeared below the surface of the river, never to be seen again, was her laugh. It rang through the forest like 1,000 tinkling bells. Igbaghon was satisfied. In making Emokpagbe mute, she had at last got her revenge. Never again did she return to the surface of the water. Never again did she punish any human who strayed into her domain. She returned to her land of immortality, and the river continues to bear her name to this day.